Welcome to episode 7 of Breaking the Ice. We're your hosts, Elliott Simpson, Ayoe Kristiansen, and Dr. Jessica Shadian. This week, we're holding a discussion centered on the political relationship in the Arctic between Canada and Greenland. Despite increasing interest in tightening the relationship between Canada and Greenland in the North American Arctic, Canada still does not have formal representation in Greenland, and Greenland's official representative to Ottawa remains in Washington, D.C. Today we will discuss what our two countries are doing and what they are not doing, politically, diplomatically, and economically, to bring Canada and Greenland closer together. We are joined by Leona Alleslev, MP for Aurora, Oak Ridges, and Richmond Hill here in Ontario, and Vittus Qujaukitsoq, Greenland's former Minister for Finance and Nordic Cooperation. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here. So this is our second summer that we've had our podcast series, which is now evolving into webinar style for Breaking the Ice. And every year we do different topics. And so this summer we have two streams, and we have one on innovation in the North and one on strengthening Canadian-Greenlandic relations. And so I'm really excited to have both of you for this conversation here. I will just quickly say that, Leona, you were one of our first interviews that we did last summer, and that was before we even figured out how to make the podcast work. And so that was a written, actually, interview. So I'm really happy to have you back. And Vittus, you attended our Arctic conference, Arctic 360 conference, I don't know, like 3 days before we went on lockdown. So what was that, now a year and a half ago? And so thank you. You were an excellent, you were excellent at that conference. You're a sharpshooter, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm really happy to have you here today. So I'll just say to both of you, I guess, welcome back. So.
Thank you.
Yes, then Elliott and me will start introducing you. I will begin. I shall introduce Vittus Qujaukitsoq. Vittus was educated at the Greenlandic Business School in 1993 and then began working as an interpreter for the Greenlandic government in 1994. In 1995 to 1996, he worked as a negotiator for the labor union of Greenland. He was also the private secretary for Lars Emil Johansen from 2007 to 2008 in the Danish government in Copenhagen. In 2013 to 14, Vittus served as the Minister of Finance and Interior. And in 2014 to 15, he was Minister of Industry, Labor, Trade and Foreign Affairs. Furthermore, in 2015 to 2016, he took the role of Minister of Finance, Minerals and Foreign Affairs. In 2017, he was the founder and the chairman for the Greenlandic political party, Nunatta. Most recently, between 2018 to 2021, he was Minister of Finance and Nordic Cooperation. Welcome to the discussion.
Thank you.
And moving over to Leona. Leona Alleslev was first elected to the House of Commons in 2015 and was re-elected in 2019 as the MP for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill, Ontario. After being elected in 2015, Leona was appointed as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. She later served on the National Defence Committee, Foreign Affairs International Development Committee, the Citizenship and Immigration Committee, and was chair of the Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association. In 2018, Leona was appointed Shadow Cabinet Minister for Global Security. Then in November 2019, Leona was appointed as Deputy Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition and shortly after named Shadow Cabinet Minister for Foreign Affairs. She served in the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee and the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. She's also a member of the Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association, part of the Science and Technology Committee. Prior to serving as an MP, Leona was a Canadian Air Force officer and has held leadership positions at the Department of National Defence, as well as senior managerial roles with IBM Canada and Bombardier Aerospace. Leona earned a BA Honours in History and Political Science from the RMC in Kingston and received her Queen's Commission to serve as an Air Force Logistic Officer. Thank you so much for joining us. Our first question will go to
Can I
Leona.
just quickly jump in? I want to introduce our two hosts. So I would like
Oh,
to
of course. Well,
introduce Elliott and Ayoe, and they are our podcast interns for this summer. And Elliott, he's a master's student from the Monk School, and we're very happy to have Ayoe this year, who's a master's student at the University of Greenland. And so I can't think of two better people to be leading this discussion. So I'll let you both take it from there.
thank you very much. So the first question we'll put to you, Leona. While we were researching this episode, I saw from your website on the page titled "Nation Building and Arctic Sovereignty" that for Canada, now is not the time for a complacency, fear, or retreat. So, do you feel that Canada has been complacent in asserting its sovereignty in the Canadian North?
I think that's an important topic to discuss, because essentially what my perspective is that the status quo in the Arctic is fundamentally changing, both from an economic, a political, and a defense and security perspective, and climate change is further accelerating that. I don't believe that Canada has prioritized the Arctic to the extent that it needs to. And so I would argue that the time is now for a sense of urgency to define and develop an Arctic strategy for Canada.
So then, would you say then that it's fair to say that this complacency extends to other things like infrastructure, business development, and food security?
I would say that the situation is changing very rapidly, and I would say that Canada perhaps hasn't fully appreciated just how quickly the status quo is changing, and therefore responded accordingly, and is lagging behind some of our peers, both our adversaries and our allies, and that is putting Canada at a significant disadvantage.
So then, to look outside of our borders for a moment, then in terms of our northern neighbor Greenland, what could Canada be doing to strengthen cooperation with Greenland? I mean, for instance, the U.S. has established a formal diplomatic post in Nuuk. Should Canada be considering this as well?
I think Canada should be considering all variety of things, which is why I think a priority for an Arctic strategy needs to be one of the first things that we do. We need to look at what we're going to do economically in the Arctic to lay the foundations to position ourselves for future growth. We need to look at our diplomatic relationships to be able to strengthen those and identify what areas we need to put more effort into, because of course trade, security are all based on relationships, and so we need to do more in that area. And then we need to look at our defense and security as well as our long-term research. So those are sort of four areas that I think need to be included as a priority in an Arctic strategy, and certainly strengthening our relationships with Greenland and our other Arctic allies, nations, and participation in the region.
Thank you, Leona. The next question is for Vittus. There seems to be a increasing interest by Greenland to straighten ties with Canada, North, and vice versa. Would you agree?
Certainly. I think the general emphasis on Arctic is good for both Greenland and probably Canada and those around Arctic in general. We have seen an increase of investments and the pursuit of extracting minerals and the attempts to make use of other roads like the Northwest Passage, for instance. So we see multiple aspects on the increased agenda on the Arctic, and Greenland is no exception in this focus.
What do you think? What do you see as the most important area where Canada and Greenland should work together to strengthen cooperation with each other?
I think a formal diplomatic connection between Greenland and Canada is necessary. But if you look at why there hasn't been any further development in this regard, perhaps has to do with the presumption of Canadian federal government on how they regard Greenland. They don't regard Greenland as a legal neighbor. Canada has been investing on their relationship with Denmark instead of Greenland. Greenland is positioned geographically next to Canada. So I think Canada has been neglecting its obligations to recognize Greenland as a legitimate neighbor. And we see it in the lack of any attempt of establishing a further connection. And I think it's a shame that there hasn't been any further development thinking of US establishing a consulate in Greenland. But you have to mind that the consulate has not come by itself. It's an investment of many years of hard attempt to lure Greenland to US to Greenland. And it has to do with the American interests on many levels that has paved the way for American presence today. And I hope this focus on our relationships between Greenland and Canada could make some focus on the agendas and the items need to be resolved in order for us to have a stronger ties.
How can Canada best help strengthen this relationship? Now you mentioned the ties.
Well, I think US has done the first right thing is to establish a consulate in Greenland. And I think Canada ought to do a similar thing. We have been discussing how to improve the connections between Greenland and Canada for many years, but there hasn't been any tangible change in our relationships. And I think it is good that Canada is contemplating on how they're dealing with the Indigenous peoples in Canada, thinking of what is happening at the moment. And I think it's good that the Canadian government is attempting on easing the troubled past on the treatment of the Indigenous people in Canada. And I think it will have a beneficial impact on the dealings with the other people across the Arctic, I guess.
You have already answered a little bit about my next question, but just to put it a little bit more clearly out there, do you think it would be helpful if Greenland had diplomatic representation in Canada separate from the US?
I think so. I think it will be a win-win situation if Canada established a representation in Greenland. And for our part, I think we need to emphasize the neighborhood connections by introducing a formal office in Canada, placed in Canada.
Thank you.
So then same question to you, Leona. How helpful do you think it would be if Greenland's formal representation to Canada was actually based in Ottawa as opposed to being based in DC?
So just to be clear, I'm not a member of the governing party. And so the fact that since 2018, there's been a joint task force between Canada and Greenland to determine what the diplomatic relationships should be and other things, and we've seen no result from it, is very disconcerting. the fact that we have a significant militarization of the Russian military, as well as assertion of China that the Chinese Communist Party, that they have aspirations to the Arctic and that they are a northern Arctic nation, the threats are very real. Canada needs to focus more on those who are like-minded and those who share our vision, our responsibility, our priorities, our respect for the rule of law, all those kinds of things, which clearly Greenland falls into that category. So there is no downside, only drastic and dramatic upside to having stronger relationships in the region. And those relationships happen by over Zoom, but by physically being present in both locations when we're not under a pandemic. But ultimately, the more that we get together, the more opportunity we have to be present with each other, the more ability do we have to have complex but important conversations. So no question, we need to move uh, further along those strengthening of diplomatic ties. Presence, physical presence, is definitely a major aspect of that. And again, we need to understand what that joint task force has found out and move the conversation along more quickly.
I just want to touch on something quickly that you mentioned in terms of the security situation in the Arctic. Lots has been written about this, and it's a very topical discussion. Leona, in terms of Canada's strategy towards all this, do you think that the Canadian, for example, security strategy in the Arctic is distinct from its strategy when it comes to things like the bridging the infrastructure gap, or making the North more accessible to people that live in, I'm joining the Zoom call from Toronto. So do you think that the current strategy of Canada towards the North and the Arctic is comprehensive, or is it piecemeal?
I think that's a fundamental point. Well done. And I would completely agree that part of our challenge is we tend to look at these things in isolated stovepipes rather than looking at them as comprehensive, interdependent, and integrated things. Ultimately, if you have infrastructure to get water, food security, resources, and other economic opportunities, well, then obviously you're going to be in a better position to provide critical security and defense to those economic and people requirements. So our problem, like I said, is we do not have an Arctic strategy. That Arctic strategy does not bring together the multiple areas that are all interdependent, from political, diplomatic, economic, transportation, climate change, research, mapping, to infrastructure, to defense and security. So one of the first things we really need to commit to, and we are, I believe, a bit behind on this, is to having that definition of a strategy, that vision, make it a priority, and recognize that all of these things are interdependent and are critical to the future long-term prosperity and security of Canada.
Now, speaking of long-term prosperity, moving on to mining. So mining is very important to both the Greenlandic and the Northern Canadian economy, and this includes the critical minerals, which are the means to the renewable energy economy and other technologies for the next century. So right now, I think it's fair to say that China has a bit of a monopoly on the global supply of these critical minerals. Both Canada and Greenland do have separate bilateral cooperation agreements with the US on these minerals. Do you see the mining sector as a place for increased North American Arctic cooperation between Canada, the US, and Greenland?
I would say that there's an opportunity for cooperation on all fronts, not the least of which is critical minerals. The interesting thing about the pandemic is that it has, in many respects, laid bare a lot of the challenges that we were just starting to be more aware of that we were facing, and it has accelerated and highlighted the critical nature of them. One of which is Canada's self-sufficiency in terms of some critical areas. I mean, certainly we know about personal protective equipment and critical medical drug ingredients that we just don't have access to, that have put our own internal security and safety at risk. That then can be extended to things like critical minerals, technological advancements from iPhones to the new green technologies are the foundation for the future. If we don't recognize that we need to prioritize those things and have a certain amount of self-sufficiency and resilience in those areas, we risk rapidly being left behind. That then extends to relationships with our like-minded allies who have the same priorities and values as we do. And so certainly critical minerals is one of those key pieces in any future, both from economic prosperity as well as defense and security. And Canada needs to prioritize who we allow access to, ensuring that we are able to maintain our own self-sufficiency and that we are working with other like-minded nations in that regard. And President Biden has made that one of his priorities in the recent outline of the things that he wants to focus on in terms of cooperation with Canada. So critical minerals is definitely on the priority list, and relationships around those critical minerals, particularly in our Arctic, with places like Greenland and the United States, I believe need to be prioritized in our Arctic strategy and need to be something that we take far more seriously, I would argue, than we are currently.
I was muted. Just a fast question for Leona. I hope that is okay. Yes, you're on mute. Thank you. It's more like you just said that Canada would be behind, and I was wondering if you could like explain that a little bit more, what you meant by being behind.
Well, as we've seen from the pandemic, if we don't have access to critical things in our supply chain, then we become dependent on other countries. If we're dependent on other countries who perhaps don't share our perspective, then the denial of access to those critical resources, in the case of PPE or in the case of drugs and medicinal ingredients, puts us at risk. Not being able to open quickly in the pandemic means that our economy is delayed in terms of recovering, et cetera, et cetera. So the same thing would be true for the things that are in critical minerals. If we don't have the critical minerals, we can't be at the forefront of developing the environmental leading edge renewable technologies, or simply other technologies like iPhones and things like that that are dependent on those critical minerals. So the countries that have access to it quickly can then dominate the market or prevent other people from having access to those critical technologies, etc. And that would put, if Canada were one, at that disadvantage, particularly when we have those critical minerals, that will drastically affect our long-term economic prosperity as we perhaps miss out on opportunities to leverage the strength that we have in Canada to position ourselves for the future.
Thank you, Leona. Next question is for Vittus. In terms of uranium in Greenland, in your time as naalakkersuisoq for foreign affairs, you worked for Greenland's right to export uranium. In the year of 2021, what do you think is Greenland's successes and failures when it comes to uranium?
First, I think the abolishment of the zero tolerance policy toward radioactive materials from 2013 is at risk of being reversed again after only 8 years. And I think it's a failure in sense of the attempts to utilize the radioactive content materials, including rare earth elements in Greenland, have suffered a huge damage in our credibility, because Greenland introduced and adopted various international conventions to be able to deal with the radioactive content materials, the logistics, safety, how to handle radiation, security, and not least the trade and the tracing of the materials once utilized. And those conventions have been adopted, and it's going to be interesting on how the new government is going to impose its policy on reversing the tolerance policy, and how they're going to adopt it in our legislation once we already have accepted and adopted various conventions. So it's going to be a very interesting time on how they're going to implicate the mining industry, because Greenland's credibility as an investment object is at risk, not least, and our credibility has been damaged by this. So it's going to be interesting on how all these are going to be incorporated in our legislation, and not least the Mineral Resources Act that is allowing the utility of the radioactive content materials.
Thank you. Do you see the mining sector as a place for increased cooperation with Canada? And do you see an advantage in strengthening North American Arctic cooperation in this area?
Canada has always been a role model in terms of mining industry, and Greenland has through the years been working closely with Canada in terms of adopting the regulations and the frames in all dealings with mining, including impact benefit agreements that we have been inspired by the Canadian setup, and we've been using Canadian expertise and consulted us for a number of years. And we've been to Canada for many years to get inspiration on all dealings with the mining. So I guess the ties are already there, but we need to have a more strengthened relationship, and that could be a task for a consulate to perhaps put the right frames.
Now, this next question, I think I'll put to both of you, but I think we'll begin with Leona. So in terms of critical infrastructure, which is something that I think we can all agree both Greenland and the Canadian North need, do you think that greater cooperation between our two countries could help attract more investment into the region and sell it as an attractive place to do business and to build critical infrastructure?
Well, absolutely. companies want to invest when they know there's a plan. And when they know that that plan is backed or supported or prioritized by the population and the government. And so, again, not to sound like a broken record, if we had an Arctic strategy that prioritized these things, then industry, private sector, as well as the provinces and government and territories, would know that this is a priority. And so there's going to be a higher probability that people will come and invest, not only in the infrastructure, but in the mining opportunities or just other economic opportunities. Because, like we've said, it's a whole ecosystem, not separate and distinct things. So if we make it a priority from a government, from a country perspective, then the cooperation will also be a priority, then the investments will come. And to tie on to a little bit of what Vittus was just saying, the fact is that Canada's mining industry are world leaders in terms of how we do it from an environmental perspective and from the research and development that we put into ensuring that we maintain and are always pushing the leading edge of that. And again, the more cooperation, then the more emphasis there will be on maintaining that leadership position. And it will then extend to a whole bunch of other things. So absolutely, if the government puts it as a priority, then the investment will come. And this is not only about the Arctic. In many respects, it's about nation building. And we have to commit to not only saying we're going to do it, but to actually getting it done. We haven't been particularly good in Canada on a number of fronts in terms of getting things built. And that is having a drastic impact on our economic prosperity and our ability to compete globally. So not only do we need to put the strategy in place, but that strategy and cooperation agreements have to have clear performance metrics so that we hold ourselves collectively accountable to not only saying we're going to do something, but to actually getting it done.
And Vittus, same question to you about greater cooperation to attract investment to the region.
For Greenland's part, I think the infrastructure in regards to airports and harbors are adequate to accommodate the tourism and the industry in general. Our mineral resources and the commodities connected to the minerals are placed in very remote areas that needs a huge investment to utilize. And I think the stumbling block in terms of mining for Greenland's part is that the minerals are very difficult to obtain and lies in very remote areas, which means that once you start mining, you need to invest infrastructure from zero. So it's a considerable thing to accommodate when you are to invest in Greenland. And I guess the same applies in the high North Canada and in Alaska and elsewhere. It's the remoteness of those minerals that makes it difficult. We have the necessary infrastructure. We have been constructing international airports in Nuuk and elusive. So our capacity have been gradually improved through massive investments that the previous government has put on the emphasis. And the next thing I see is is all the aspects dealing with the traffic and the seafare in terms of a greater transportation in the high Arctic is due to the climate change we see. And there needs to be a setup on how to accommodate search and rescue and the safety net that has to be in place. We need to have a dialogue between Greenland and Canada on how we can improve the connections in dealing with the higher frequency of ships coming to our seas. And the next thing is, of course, the tensions between Russia, China, in the Arctic, and the dispute over North Pole is also something that we need to consider how it can be resolved peacefully amongst our countries. So there are multiple tasks to be resolved, and that can only be done by having diplomatic connections between our countries.
Could I add to that for just a moment?
Please do.
Because again, Vittus made an excellent point. Back to us looking at this sort of in compartmentalized areas. Often when we talk about infrastructure, it's in the context of to get to remote locations for mining. Or we talk about infrastructure because we're looking at transportation routes or whatever. We're not looking at the investment in the infrastructure to do multiple things in a system of infrastructure rather than unique one specific objectives. And so we need in the Arctic an overall infrastructure strategy that looks at search and rescue, that looks at ports, that looks at airports, that looks at roads. So a system of infrastructure, not just individual pieces to achieve individual objectives. And that's why it's a big project. That's why a strategy is so important. And that's why diplomatic relations and cooperation conversations are so important, because we can then understand all the aspects of it so that we make sure that we're spending wisely in the right order and in the right priority to achieve the greatest outcome at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Leona. I have one more question before we go to Jessica, and it's for both of you. How can we straighten trade business collaboration between Canada and Greenland? And does infrastructure need to be built first? Shall we start with you, Leona?
So I would say that the infrastructure doesn't need to be built first. The conversations and the planning to invest wisely, smartly, effectively, and efficiently needs to happen first, which is why this needs to, they talk about a whole of government, but this needs to be a whole of government, federal and territorial and provincial and regional and businesses, and not only the mining sector or whatever, but business organizations, people like Arctic 360, climate change, research and development, universities. It's a big project, but it's a big opportunity. And getting it right quickly and effectively is the way to do it. So essentially, yes, we need to have conversations with our cooperation partners like Greenland and the United States and Norway and Sweden and whoever else, as well as each of the critical industry sectors, as well as all other partners, so that we can understand what we can achieve and how quickly we can achieve it, and that we do it in the right order, as opposed to ad hoc from one aspect or another. So absolutely. But you're right, critical infrastructure needs to be top of the list because we're not going to be able to leverage any of the opportunities, very much like the railway of 150 years ago. Canada basically built a country by building a railway from coast to coast. This is the next conversation that we need to have about a pretty important and significant next frontier for Canada that needs to know that they're part of Canada and that they can make an incredible contribution, not only to Canada, but to the northern region and in turn to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to answer with this?
Sure. I think it's not a question of investing more money in our infrastructures in order to enhance or to improve the connectivity between Greenland and Canada. I think it's a question of the willingness or the desire to strengthen the partnership between Canada and Greenland. So it's a political question, not least. And the other thing is that we have two very distinct legislative traditions, while Greenland is more European minded than the laws and the judicial systems are quite different compared with Canada. So there is a natural hindrance, so to say. There needs to be a harmonization in order to build the businesses between our countries. It should be not complex to resolve it, since Greenland has a small population. We have in the past had air link between Nunavut and Greenland in the past, but there is a deficit to be covered on how it can be resolved. So there is economic aspects as well that needs to be answered by both sides, not only from one point, but by both parts. The willingness to do business, and not least on how we can accommodate a trade that is attractive for both parts.
Excellent. I think I'm going to spend 1 minute maybe summarizing a bit of what I'm hearing, and then I'm going to launch into a last question. This has been excellent. I think that both of you have offered very poignant and excellent observations and discussions in advancing this conversation. You know, Leona, you're pointing to the fact that we really need a comprehensive, a real strategic Arctic strategy here in Canada, and you're saying we shouldn't sit in silos. So of course we can almost see then this as being as something that's, you know, it's civil and it's military when it comes to infrastructure, and it serves a social good, but also helps protect sovereignty. But also at the same time, you know, this is going to require private capital, and goes much beyond the federal government. And you know, one thing that we've often talked about this region, about the North American Arctic, is that it's actually really maybe, you know, together, Alaska, Northern Canada, and Greenland have many commonalities that range across the board, one being infrastructure, that it is almost like, you know, an emerging economy in and of itself in terms of its needs and where things are in terms of, you know, economic, social, political, and possibly, you know, the world's then, if you think of it that way, you know, safest emerging economy because of, not least because of the political values that all these nations have. And of course, then if you want to attract private capital at the same time, right, you need then economies of scale. And so this is where thinking more regionally and speaking to Vittus, talking about there is a real strategic regional play in here when we talk about ports and marine infrastructure and how infrastructure should be built, because there's you're going to have greater marine transportation, but this is beyond just green. Why is there going to be more coming to Greenland? Because of this, these new trade routes that are emerging. And so with that comes, a more strategic perspective about the region. And so thinking, how ports connect to one another is an important thing. How to increase, broadband and 5G. So so I think there's a lot here. And so maybe the particulars of each place are different, but in many ways they connect to one another, and thinking from a regional perspective has a lot to offer. And not least, this begins with the, more growing the diplomatic relationship in order to have these more ongoing, consistent conversations. So I've noticed, I've been following, probably like you all have, the recent G7 meetings, and now we've got NATO happening. And so, when the G7 met in Europe, they came together and they found, that China's now a new discussion that didn't used to be there. And one of their solutions for how to kind of band together and maybe help offset some of China's ambitions is to create this infrastructure initiative, but for developing nations. And I found that quite interesting. And so as an alternative, possibly, to the, how to build something up that's an alternative to the Brick and Road Initiative. And we know that, here, part of that Brick and Road Initiative is the Polar Silk Strategy. So in 2019, Canada produced, two fantastic reports, but one of them out of the Senate actually had a recommendation to create a pan-Arctic infrastructure bank or a fund that could go through the Arctic Council. And so the Arctic nations themselves could create some sort of fund together to help galvanize and attract more capital to the region to build infrastructure. And so I'm wondering if that might be something that is of interest, and especially on the Canadian side. I wonder, because I know we see that Trudeau would really like to be engaged in the China discussion when he was at G7 and these type of things. And so is there maybe a possible opportunity here through the Arctic Council? I'll start with that, and then I'll pivot to you, Vittus, with a follow-up. But you both can answer starting there.
So there's two things in that question in part. One is, do we think that we should back up our strategic objectives with real money and our cooperation with some financial commitments all around? And there's no question, if we believe that this region matters for all the reasons that we've cited, and if we collectively, through our cooperation, believe that we don't have the luxury of time and we need to do something about it relatively quickly, not only for the health and well-being of our own countries, but for the contribution that it could make to the world. There's no question that the ice is melting. There's no question that the Northwest Passage is a highly attractive transportation route that will dwarf in many respects the Suez Canal if all of the projections come to fruition. And so therefore, controlling what could be one of the world's most significant trade routes is not something to be taken lightly. So do we need to back it up with money? Do we need to do it soon? And do we need to commit to a joint vision for what that should look like for like-minded nations, recognizing the global security and economic framework? Absolutely, yes. My concern is in the title. Because we have seen the Asian Infrastructure Bank, there's a whole bunch of baggage perhaps around that title and how it has been implemented, the oversight or lack of oversight, the objectives and means that have been used as a result of it. So sometimes a great idea can be defeated simply by the title and the corresponding misinterpretation. So do we need to find a way to have a regional cooperative nation joint vision? Absolutely. Do we need to back it up with money, government investment, as well as private sector? Absolutely. Do we need to be very careful about how we define it and the terms and conditions around it so that it's not confused with other initiatives that perhaps have taken advantage of populations or have had alternate strategic interests to our own? Yes, we very much need to do that. So I think it's an excellent question, all fits in. The strategy defines the what and to some extent the who, and then we can't forget about the how and the performance objectives to ensure that we're actually achieving the goals that we've set for our collective selves. Thank you.
Vittus, I'll let you.
Thank you. I concur to the need of considering where the investments ought to come from. I think we have an obligation to ensure our security first of all, and I think there is a need for looking at how the safety of our nations can be resolved first in terms of utilizing mineral resources. And I think looking at China, whether if China is a threat or a blessing in terms of investments, I think it's a double-edged sword that we have to have in mind in regards to not being depending too much or heavily on China. So there is a safety issue or strategic considerations we need to put forward from everything, and which is why it is important to emphasize on the investments coming from United States and Canada, not least in terms of developing our mining industries. We have emphasized on U.S. investments for many years, and it is only for the past 2 or 3 years where this diplomatic effort has been fruitful, since the U.S. interest on Greenland has been more visible and more tangible in terms of seeing concrete initiatives in terms of investments and funds being relieved to various developments in Greenland. And it only comes because of our desire to attract US investments in Greenland. And it has been done through our representative office in Washington, D.C., not least, and our effort to attract US political decision makers from the departments and the government. So it's many years of effort that is the result of the US presence in Greenland, and I see a desire to develop, and I hope that Canada will look at what US is doing for time being. So I can only encourage Canada to do a similar effort to improve the connections with Greenland in the future.
Excellent. So maybe what we're saying is I shouldn't have said Pan-Arctic. maybe it's something a little bit more of building up a trilateral relationship, let's say, and that could take the form of strengthening diplomatic ties, economic ties, and perhaps that could then also include strengthening the ability to attract capital to the region as a safe and great place to invest. So I'd just like to provide both of you one last quick opportunity. If you'd like to ask a question to each other or to anyone before we wrap up our time. Off the cuff.
I simply want to say thank you to you guys, Vittus for attending, and to Arctic 360 for having this, because this is an important conversation. Yes, it's positioning for the long term, so it's not something that necessarily makes the front page of the Globe and Mail every day, but it's no less important and no less something that we absolutely need to be discussing. So thank you for making sure that we have the opportunity to have these conversations and to include as many people as we can in what will be and should be a very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also like to thank the organizers for sharing my thoughts with you, and I think for this interesting dialogue. And I hope my perspectives can ease Canada to consider Greenland more as a neighbor, because we have common interests and common challenges in the Arctic. So it is a win-win situation, as I see it, to involve more between our countries. So I can only encourage the Canadian government to invest more on how to improve the connections with Greenland. And I think Greenland is considering how we can improve our relationship with Nunavut first of all, but with Canada on the second hand is also important for us, because we have the common stocks at our seas. We have borders to each other, and we have the Arctic Sea to consider. We have the climate change challenges that we have to mind, and the health issues to consider, and to build up the businesses and the industries, not only in mining, but in tourism, etc. So I guess there is a thought of benefiting each other money-wise, but also on strengthening the relationship between our people.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you both so much. And I left off last time, and I'll just say it the same again, that this is a real great contribution to the conversations that we should be having more often. We know that diplomacy really is effective and begins with relationships, and building those relationships takes time, and they take a lot of work. And so hopefully Elliott and Ayoe, by the time in 15 years from now, when they're sitting in your two seats, they'll have already built up a big, 15 years of competence and professional relations with one another that Greenland and the Canadian North, but all of Canada will be much closer friends by then. Old neighbors, let's just say. So thank you both. Thank you both so much.
Thank
Have
you.
a great, thank you.
Thank you.